So I'm going to be presenting data that addresses the question of degree of dependence on ends, and in particular JUUL system ends, which I'll refer to just as JUUL. Now, the public health benefit of ends comes from helping smokers switch away from cigarette smoking, on which they are likely dependent, toward nicotine source without the dangers of smoking. And from that perspective, a certain degree of dependence on ends may be a necessary and helpful feature, but it has nevertheless generated some concern. Now, I'll be presenting data on 4 studies. 2 are cross-sectional studies of U.S. samples, and they compare smokers to individuals using JUUL in adults and in youth. And I'll be presenting 2 longitudinal studies, one of which has U.S. and Canada data that look at changes in dependence as smokers go from smoking to using JUUL. So this first study is a cross-sectional study of U.S. adults, and we're going to compare adults exclusively smoking and adults exclusively using JUUL, and that's because analysis showed that the scale, which was developed by the NIH-funded PROMISE group, was not valid for comparison within dual users. When we make that comparison, what we see is that dependence is lower among JUUL users than it is among cigarette smokers. So here we see the same pattern in a study of similar design, but with youth, where we see again that the individuals using JUUL have lower dependence than the individuals who are smoking. But it's also useful to have a longitudinal perspective, that is, to understand what happens as an individual smoker goes from smoking either to complete switching or to using JUUL in a dual use modality. And this is a longitudinal study in which adults were recruited at the time they purchased a JUUL starter kit. Their dependence was measured at baseline, and then a month later, now using a measure developed by the NIH and FDA-funded PATH group, which was valid for assessing dual use. And so here's what we see for the result. We see that in both groups, both those who switched completely and those initially engaging in dual use, dependence has gone down. It's gone down more steeply in those who are 1-month dual users, but that's because their cigarette dependence was higher to begin with. And what that reflects is that more dependent smokers are slower to switch. And so the ones who were still using cigarettes, still dual users at 1 month, tend to be those with higher initial dependence. The other longitudinal study provides additional perspective because here we were able to compare what happens over time with complete switching among smokers who were using one of 2 different nicotine concentrations, 5% or 3%, which correspond to 59 or 35 milligrams per ml. And what we see is that overall nicotine dependence declines, and importantly, it declines to the same degree in those using the 3% and 5% nicotine concentration. So the nicotine concentration, which is self-selected, does not affect the degree of dependence. In summary, we see very consistently that dependence on JUUL is lower than dependence on cigarettes. We see this using different scales in exclusive users and dual users, in adults and youth, across persons and within persons, and for different nicotine concentrations. Now again, some degree of dependence helps facilitate switching, and data not presented here shows that use of these products is associated with very high rates of switching. But consistently, dependence on JUUL is less than dependence on cigarettes.